AECI Plant Health, unlocking nature's potential.
Today we'll be discussing semiochemistry with AECI, and I'd like to welcome Reshma Gayaram. Welcome, Reshma.
Thank you very much.
Plaas TV. Yes, what is semiochemistry?
Well, to give you a quick and basic answer, semiochemistry is a chemical means of communication used by any living species. So we all use semiochemistry. But to explain a little bit further, when an organism releases a signaling molecule, it can either target another organism of a similar species, same species, or of a different species. And if it's the same species, it's referred to as intraspecific, and if it's a different species, it's interspecific. But now semiochemistry, it's a very broad topic. I'd be here for days talking about it. But I think for today's discussion, I'd like to focus on one of the semiochemical signals, being pheromones, and explain to you how we use pheromones to control pest populations in agriculture.
Well, that's what we'll be discussing next, and that is, how do we use pheromones to control pest population?
Well, there's a technique called mating disruption, and that's actually used to suppress pest populations. Now, with specific reference to the Lepidoptera order of insects, in a natural setting, the female moth would emit a very powerful airborne trail of its attractant, or also known as a scent, and we refer to that trail as a pheromone plume. The male moth then is guided by this plume to find its female moth, obviously that's emitting the pheromone. And once it finds the female, obviously mating will occur, and as a resultant effect, offspring would be increased, and there'll be a pest population progression. Okay, so mating disruption is, as I said, it suppresses pest populations, and it's used for decades around the world. But what it does is it exploits the natural process that I just mentioned. But now it uses a false pheromone trail. So we've got a product called Isomate, which is our advanced mating disruption technology. And that product as well has been in the market for decades. It's stood the test of time. And in that time that it's been in the market, it's worked successfully to reduce pest populations. The product we actually get from a supplier in Japan called Shinitsu, and we are, as AECI, are the official distributors in South Africa and Africa. Now with Isomate, those dispensers contain a synthetic form of the target pest's pheromone. And what happens is these dispensers are placed strategically in trees, and with a slow release system, the pheromone is then given off and it saturates that orchard so that this poor male moth becomes confused and disorientated, and he cannot respond to the female calling. So in that process, obviously there's no mating that occurs, so there's a massive impact on pest population abundance. And obviously when there's no mating, there's no eggs, there's no larvae, so that area that's actually treated by Isomate is protected. So you would have no damage to your crops, or very little to no damage to your crops.
Oh, it's absolutely amazing, all the technology. So Reshma, why is it so important to control these pests with Isomate?
Well, you would have heard from recent reports that the agricultural export market relies heavily on most of the crops that we produce in South Africa. And the European market is one of our biggest export markets. Now, as an importing country, they have become extremely rigid when it comes to phytosanitary compliance, and have actually imposed a zero tolerance when it comes to any major pests of concern. So, as you can imagine, if we as South Africa are not compliant with these phytosanitary regulations, we can obviously jeopardize that export market. And then obviously there'll be a huge negative impact on our growers and on the economy of the country. And then furthermore, that phytosanitary regulations ensures that that crop that enters these countries must have a maximum chemical residue limit. So we've got to do everything in our power to adhere to these regulations. And by using Isomate as a pre-harvest sort of method of control, we can then mitigate a large part of that phytosanitary risk, which is associated with pests such as false codling moth, for instance.
So what are the advantages of using the Isomate advanced technology?
Well, first of all, it's very effective in managing pests, and especially those of false codling moth, and oriental fruit moth. As I mentioned, it mitigates a large part of the phytosanitary risk. It is very environmentally friendly, and it has no chemical residues. It's very safe for humans, very safe for animals, and it is species specific. So it has no effect on non-target organisms. So your bees, your beneficials, etc. are all safe from it. And then it fits effortlessly into an integrated pest management program. And I think last but not least, I'd like to mention this. With our Isomate, we recommend much more dispensers per hectare. And the reason being, we'd like to create a localized high pheromone area. So that high concentration of pheromone will make that male moth unlikely to find his female moth. And in that way, you're halting that reproductive cycle, and you're having a huge impact on population growth, especially in high pest pressure areas.
Reshma, thank you very much for the good news you've shared with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks to Reshma Gayaram, and she's from AECI, and we had a discussion with her on Isomate advanced technology, and next time we'll be talking to McGregor and Tooley about what AECI does for the emerging farmer.
AECI Plant Health, unlocking nature's potential.